Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library. And I have a great story to tell you. Let me take you around the world and through time with 3 different stories tonight. First, I will tell you about Area 51, how this facility of the Air Force in Nevada rose to fame. Initially among UFO enthusiasts, and later in popular culture, becoming linked to many conspiracy theories. We will explore why this happened and what the facility really entails. Next, I will tell you about Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, a large collection of pre-Columbian ruins built by the ancient Puebloans more than 1,000 years ago. Despite many clues, the exact role and function of this site remains mysterious. Finally, we will jump even further back in time and discuss the hypotheses of the Toba Catastrophe, the possible eruption of a supervolcano around 70,000 to 75,000 years ago that could have plunged Earth into a volcanic winter for several years and affected the climate for several centuries. We will examine why this theory exists and what a supervolcano is like. But first, allow me to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially, which really helps us motivated to continue creating these stories for you. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds and receive regular bonus episodes. We already offer 7 exclusive episodes to our patrons, the latest one of which is about the Palace of Versailles. In addition, you will have the capability to download all these audios and listen to them offline if you'd like, and participate in selecting future topics. This topic was selected by our Patreons. We also offer advanced releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we can continue developing Lights Out Library, which we thoroughly enjoy. You will find a link in the description box and also in the first comment pinned under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of this story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. We ask that if you can, please subscribe to the channel and click on the like button. This helps us promote the channel and eliminate advertisements as much as YouTube allows us to. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now, assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched. and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now, it's time to explore. Our starting point is in Nevada, in the middle of the desert. I am sure you have already heard of Area 51. But Area 51, it's not its official name. It is a common name for a U.S. Air Force facility that is officially called Homey Airport, or sometimes called Groom Lake. The closest large city to the base is Las Vegas, 80 miles to the southeast. Contrary to what one may suppose, the fame of Area 51 is rather recent in popular culture, only about 30 years. How did it all begin? The base operated long before it became famous. An airfield was built on the site in 1942. But that was a very basic airfield. The base really started to exist in the 1950s, when it was chosen by the U.S. Air Force to establish a test facility for the development of a particular aircraft, the Lockheed U-2. We will come back to that. For about 30 years, the base operated, and hardly anyone talked about it in the media. It had no presence in popular culture at all. It was and still is remote. So only military personnel, government officials, and immediate neighbors ever thought or talked about it. The closest inhabited area is a small town called Rachel, with a population of 48, according to the latest census. From the 1950s to the 1970s, there were alleged sightings of strange aerial phenomena, UFOs, maybe, around the facility, and so a few UFO hunters may have heard of it. However, at the time, since the 1950s, there had been a huge rise in number of alleged sightings of flying objects all across the United States and in other parts of the world too. So this particular facility, this base, was just one site among many, and there was nothing sufficient to make it really famous. If you had asked average Americans in the 60s about UFO activity, they might have mentioned the Roswell incident that occurred in 1947 in New Mexico, which had risen to fame, but certainly not Area 51. It is unclear how the facility got the popular name of Area 51. It could be because there is a grid in this area created by the Atomic Energy Commission, with different areas that were given different numbers. Even though the facility itself is not an atomic facility, it is adjacent to this grid. So maybe the name persisted, or it was colloquially given the number 51 because it is adjacent to Area 15. But as I mentioned before, Area 51 is not the official name. The status of Area 51 in popular culture started to change only in the 1980s. Interest in UFOs had spiked in the 1950s, reflected in many movies at the time featuring flying saucers and a taste for science fiction. This interest then receded until the late 1970s and early 80s when it revived. Commercially successful books discussed UFO sightings or alleged contacts with aliens, particularly a 1980 book about Roswell. By then, The Roswell incident had almost been forgotten, and this book sparked renewed interest in it. There were also movies and TV shows in the late 70s and early 80s that helped rekindle interest in space and extraterrestrials, such as Close Encounters of the Third Kind, E.T., Star Wars movies, Alien, and V. It is difficult to determine exactly if these media productions reflected or propelled popular interest, probably both. In any case, ufology circles grew significantly in the 1980s. Many people were drawn to them out of curiosity and interest. It remained a rather underground movement, possibly still so today, but it grew considerably. Another aspect of this new wave of interest in UFOs since the 1980s, which differed from the previous one in the 1950s, was that confidence in government transparency, and perhaps even honesty, had declined among at least a subset of the population. So it came with suspicion against the government, believing or at least questioning the possibility that the government withheld information that should not be classified, manipulated, spied on citizens, or even acted knowingly against the population. This is another debate, but obviously, society has changed since the 1950s. Was it due to decades of the Cold War, the rise in individualism, the Vietnam War, Watergate, or other causes? It is hard to tell, but defiance towards the government and the loss of trust have happened since the 1950s, and I think it is fair to say that this trend has not diminished. Maybe it has strengthened since the 1980s. I'm telling you all this because it is certainly important to understand how the image of Area 51 in popular culture and all the conspiracy theories that exist around it could appear. It is hard for a government or the military to counter claims that they hide things, because, of course, they do. Secrecy is part of military research, diplomacy, and intelligence. Certain archives are not accessible to the public, at least not immediately. There are even legal frameworks and rules for that. So, is it possible to be sure that the government is perfectly law-abiding and does not cross lines or retain information using this secrecy? No. There are examples of governments hiding experiments or lying. So it is probably healthy to always have a degree of doubt. But the point here, to return to Area 51, is that since the 1980s, this loss of trust in governments has taken on bigger proportions. Over time, it has become a theme, almost a cliché, in popular culture at this point. We are so used to seeing this plot device in movies or TV shows that we take them almost as a given. In any political thriller, the government is either infiltrated, controlled by other forces, acting against people, or at the very least, hiding things. Obviously, there is a frontier between entertainment and what people really believe. But I think we can agree that conspiracy theories involving authorities are much more prevalent than they used to be. A majority of people probably don't actually believe them, or they just play with these ideas in the back of their minds. But instead of being a very underground theme like it used to be, Conspiracy theories that involve authorities, governments, and the military are now something very visible. So I'm telling you all of this because without conspiracy theories, Area 51 would not be famous. All the claims about it refer to different conspiracies, or at least the dissemination of information by authorities. The claims are not limited to supposed alien contact and technology. Even though this is the most frequent angle when Area 51 is mentioned in the media. We will look at all these claims in a minute. But to conclude on the rise to fame of Area 51, I was telling you that 40 years ago, it was not a household name yet. But during the 1980s, the site drew more and more interest in the circles of UFO enthusiasts, and in certain groups interested in conspiracy theories. This continued until a local radio interview in 1989, in which one of their representatives said that Area 51 was actually a site to study and reverse engineer alien technology. This statement had circulated for years, but it was the first time said in mainstream media, rather than non-professional or non-official publications produced by enthusiasts, or in confidential meetings between aficionados. That was only 33 years ago. But after that, things moved very quickly. A few years later, the entertainment industry had already put its hands on the idea. So it appeared in the X-Files TV show, or the movie Independence Day, which was seen by tens, even hundreds, of millions of people around the world. And in both cases, they presented the existence of alien artifacts and cover-ups by the military at Area 51 as something that had been going on for a long time. So suddenly, in the 1990s, everyone became aware that Area 51 existed, that it was not a secret base, but a base where secret things took place. And there were plenty of elements that could spark curiosity and interest in it. It was in a remote, desertic area. It had underground facilities. There had been unexplained sightings for decades around the base, and no shortage of exciting claims. These claims include the storage and study of crashed alien spacecrafts, as I said before. Probably the thing most people think about immediately when Area 51 is mentioned. But there are other claims, including that it would be a place of meetings or joint undertakings between the U.S. Air Force and extraterrestrials. Exotic high-tech weapons would be developed there, and it would be a center for the study of weather control, or, even more impressively, the development of time travel and teletransportation technology. So, what is behind these alleged activities? Possibly human activity for some of them, because there is no doubt that secret or at least confidential development of military technology took place at Area 51. The U.S. Air Force admitted it, and it is a possible explanation for UFO sightings around or near the base. When it was established in the 50s, its purpose was the development of strategic reconnaissance aircraft, the Lockheed U-2. Secrecy around this program was extreme at the time. and Area 51 was chosen as a test site because it was more remote and easier to secure than other facilities on Lockheed, the plane manufacturer, or the U.S. Air Force. The presence of a dry lake was also an advantage to build a flat and long runway. Interestingly, the U-2 was a reconnaissance aircraft, that is to say, a spy plane designed to collecting images of the ground or intercept communications while remaining very discreet. These planes were developed after the Second World War, in the context of the Cold War. Of course, there were reconnaissance flights before, including in the First World War. The first military planes used over battlefields were actually used for reconnaissance rather than direct combat. But during and after the Second World War, they became increasingly technological and specifically designed for this purpose. Typically, they fly very high to avoid detection. The Lockheed U-2 was designed to fly at 21,000 meters, or 70,000 feet. This is twice the altitude of a typical commercial flight. As the Cold War was now in place, the United States needed a new advanced reconnaissance aircraft. Lockheed proposed this program, which was approved in 1954, and test flights began in 1955. Since then, the U-2 has had a long career, being technically upgraded several times, and it is still in use. At first, the program was top secret, but it soon became well known in military circles when the first aircraft were put into operation. It then became public knowledge, especially from 1960 onwards, because one U-2 was shot down over the USSR, creating a significant international incident. Gary Powers was captured alive and tried for spying in the Soviet Union. He was then imprisoned, spending almost 2 years there until he was exchanged in Berlin and returned to the West. We cannot exactly know how many of these reconnaissance aircraft were shot down or captured on each side during the Cold War. It is possible that other cases were never made public, as the USA and the USSR did everything they could to spy on each other. Everyone knew it, and the choice to go public when spies were captured to deliberately create an incident and feign outrage was always a strategic decision. Both sides did it when they thought it served their interest at the time. So, there may have been more incidents that we never heard of. However, at least one other U-2 was shot down in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Returning to Area 51, the plane was tested there, and the program was secret. Obviously, the U.S. Air Force was not going to acknowledge that they were testing a secret aircraft when the aircraft was seen from the ground or by another plane flying surprisingly fast or at completely unusual altitudes. For decades, the official response, when there was one, attributed sightings to atmospheric phenomena, which is not a very credible explanation for an unknown flying object that can go up and down and accelerate or decelerate in flight. There are no natural phenomena that look like that. So, of course, it did nothing to discourage UFO hunters. It didn't stop with the U-2. A few years later, in the early 60s, Another project involving reconnaissance aircraft, the Lockheed A-12, was tested at Area 51. It was intended as a successor to the U-2, a successor that would have reduced radar cross-section, which is to say one harder to detect by radars, because its radar signature would be more discrete. Even more than the U-2, it looked futuristic at the time, unlike any other jet plane. It was tested at Area 51 for several years, but ultimately this model was retired by the end of the 60s and was survived by the U-2 that it initially intended to replace. This program, the A-12, was acknowledged 30 years later, in the 1990s, just when the fame of Area 51 was on the rise. Another program of the 60s included attempts to turn reconnaissance jets into drones to eliminate the risk of capture of a pilot, like what happened to Gary Powers. This was the T-21, which ultimately, after different versions and missions in real conditions, such as above China, was also retired earlier than hoped. This one became public in the 1970s. So, as you can see from the beginning, there was no shortage of secret aircraft, prototypes, or test crafts that took off and landed at Area 51. When you have these futuristic aircraft flying, sometimes far from their base, trying to be as discreet as possible, which means avoiding the sending of waves that would reveal their presence, but also means they could fly near other planes without detecting them sometimes. Plus the Air Force that doesn't want to or cannot acknowledge them, so stays silent or gives explanations that are not very credible. You have fertile ground for plenty of UFO sightings and suspicions that remain unanswered. But the activity of Area 51 did not stop there. As the base gained importance and more facilities were built on the site, it also doubled, starting in the late 60s as a place where foreign technology was studied. For decades, maybe it is still the case today, Area 51 became a place to store and examine foreign aircraft. And not just aircraft, missiles and radar systems too, mainly from the Soviet Union. The idea was not just to look for designs or inventions that could be useful, but to test how fighter jets or bombers would fare against their American counterparts, which involved fighting simulations and tests. So here again, there were a lot of flights around the base, sometimes with aircraft that were never seen in American skies. The last known program to have been developed and publicly acknowledged at Area 51 is the F-117. It is not a reconnaissance aircraft, but rather one designed for surface attack, and also it is a stealth aircraft. This means it is profiled and equipped with technologies that avoid detection by concretely reducing the reflection or emissions of waves, visible light, infrared waves, radio frequency spectrum, and audio waves. The F-17 became famous for being the first aircraft designed around stealth technology. It also had a very futuristic look with sharp angles that appeared very different from what people associated with planes, including military fighters. The design of spacecraft in sci-fi shows or movies of the past 3 decades, such as The Expanse or Battlestar Galactica, which try to have a realistic look, likely owe a lot to the lines of the F-117. The first prototypes with this kind of sharp profile were actually from the late 70s, more than 40 years ago. Thus, it is another flying object that could have looked out of place, or even alien to people in the 1980s. The F-117 is now retired, but operations continued on other programs, and maybe more than ever at this point today, since the exclusionary area around the facility was expanded in the 1990s. If we accept the premise that the U.S. Air Force or the U.S. government has acquired some alien technology, which is a big assumption, but let's take it as a hypothesis for the moment. Would it make sense to study it at Area 51? Technically, maybe. The base has specialized in dissecting foreign technology, so there would be an expertise there. What sounds less credible is that the U.S. Air Force would keep their alien technology just where everyone expects to find it. If the goal is to conduct research secretly, it may not be ideal to do it at a base constantly surrounded by curious eyes looking for it. Even though it is highly defended, everything is classified, and alien enthusiasts are kept out of the exclusionary area. I guess if I were the Air Force, I would keep Area 51 as a decoy and store my alien technology somewhere else. Actually, if we accept for a second that the U.S. government owns alien technology, the conspiracy theory I would be more inclined to credit is that Area 51 was entirely fabricated as a decoy, with just enough denial and media content to turn it into a pop culture phenomenon to attract the crowd's attention, so that they could discreetly store and study it somewhere else. But that being said, I am not aware of any tangible proof that the U.S. military or the military of any country has ever seized extraterrestrial technology. There is no shortage of people claiming it. But where is the proof that could make it more than exciting speculation? The other claims made about Area 51 fall into the same category. It is said to be a place for meetings or communication with aliens. If this were the case, it would be strange to also use the site to test aircraft. There is no logical connection between the two. The aircraft models developed at Area 51 from the 1950s with the U-2 and in the 1980s with the F-117 were always technically advanced, possibly the most advanced in the world when they first appeared. However, their capabilities, the engines, the speed, the stealth technology, the materials, seem very explainable when we look back. They did not require a technological leap that only alien technology could have provided. The proof is that around the same time, only a few years later, other countries could produce similar aircraft, or at least understand their technology. There are yet other claims about Area 51, but I have failed to find any substance to them. For instance, the idea that Area 51 would be a center for the research of climate control, time travel, or teletransportation. Why not? But why this particular site? Doesn't seem there were ever tangible elements that linked Area 51 to these activities. At least UFOs are somewhat credible because there were flying objects above the base. To most, they were unidentifiable. So technically, they were UFOs at Area 51. But they may have been man-made rather than extraterrestrial. The other claims sound more like bonus theories attached to the place because it already had a reputation for secrecy and advanced technologies. As we have seen, this reputation for secrecy was well-deserved. It is also possible that other aircraft were developed there and abandoned, or exist but are not yet known to the public. Another time I will tell you about Aurora, which was a rumored aircraft that some people suspected the U.S. was developing in the mid-'80s. This was purported to be another reconnaissance aircraft with a revolutionary profile and capabilities. Based on the rumors, it was hypersonic, able to fly at Mach 5, 5 times the speed of sound. In the 90s, claims in the UK and the US were attributed to this Aurora program. But 25 years later, we have never seen it acknowledged or in operation, and it is now widely regarded as a myth based on leaks that could have been related to another program. However, it is possible, likely even, that prototypes that are still unknown to most people, or improved versions of existing aircraft, have existed and still exist in Area 51. So even though I cannot credit these various conspiracy theories, I think it is fair to assume that secret activities are going on there, and they won't be revealed for decades, if ever. For our second story, we're going to stay in the United States, but move a little bit east to New Mexico and explore Chaco Canyon. What are the mysteries there? Chaco Canyon is quite an inhospitable place. Very hot during the summer days, but freezing cold during the winter nights. Arid. Far from forests or large expanses of cultivable land. And yet it is there that more than 1,000 years ago, people from the Ancestral Puebloan culture built a large complex that was obviously not just utilitarian. They had to quarry and transport sandstone blocks over great distances. They erected high buildings, some with 4 stories and hundreds of rooms. They brought timber from faraway forests, and on a large area they modeled the land and built it with a layout that was all but random. Buildings were aligned to capture the solar and lunar cycles. They formed geometrical patterns that took into account cardinal directions, and on a broader scale, the Central Canyon was a connection point to many villages and pueblos. Dozens of them spread over a large area through an enigmatic web of road systems. Until the 19th century, the ruins of Chaco Canyon were the largest buildings in the United States, even though they were already centuries old and had long been abandoned. This invites us to recognize the belief that large stone architecture was mainly to be found in Mesoamerica or in the Andes in pre-Columbian times. No, Chaco Canyon is a massive site, and it is very far from Mexico or Peru. So who were the builders Why did they create this site over several generations? What did it mean to them? What was its function or its functions? This remains an open question, and that's the core of the mystery. But there are ways to approach and better understand the mystery of Chaco Canyon. First of all, what does Chaco Canyon site look like and how vast is it? The canyon itself is at the center of what is now a large American national park, the Chaco Culture National Historical Park. In the canyon, there are several large complexes. The most famous and largest of them is called Pueblo Bonito, and it consists of hundreds of rooms that are all connected and ordered in a half circle. These structures, these complexes, are like a big palace or an entire village. They are called great houses, and there are several more great houses other than Pueblo Bonito. They are smaller, but each has dozens of rooms. These different great houses have been dated from different periods. But because there are also these roads that I mentioned before, and all the sites outside the canyon that were connected to it, we have to consider a larger scale. The canyon lies within a basin, San Juan Basin, that covers 7,500 square miles, 19.5 square kilometers approximately, and extends beyond New Mexico to the southwest of Colorado and parts of Utah and Arizona. Long ago, this was the heart of ancestral Puebloan culture. The Puebloan culture in Chaco emerged in a population of basket makers. Basket maker is the name of a pre-Puebloan culture that began in this region, or at least archaeologists found traces of it more than 3,000 years ago. It evolved into a distinct culture with enough traits in their architecture, their crafts, and their art to be considered a new culture. This evolution happened around the 8th century of our era, 1200 to 1300 years ago. Archaeologists have distinguished from this point on different eras in Puebloan culture. They have been given numbers, 1, 2, 3, each one corresponding to new developments and migrations too. Chaco Canyon was built during the first 3 eras and in several stages. It seems that at the time the region was less hostile than today in terms of climate. It would have been cooler and wetter. In the 9th century, the population in and around the canyon would have grown a lot. The first great houses would have been built at this time, and in the following decades, in several stages. For example, Pueblo Bonito would have been started in the 10th century AD, with a first section of 50 rooms. Traces of a system to process and trade turquoise in the canyon between different of these settlements of these great houses were found, which indicates that they had connections. Maybe these settlements all had different leaders, or there was a hierarchy between them. This is unknown. But in the 2 following centuries, Chaco Canyon prospered, and the building activity was quite intense. Until the 12th century, around 1140 AD, different communities in the region started to lose population. By the end of the 12th century, the ancient Puebloans had sealed many of their buildings with stone, and abandoned them. We know they did not vanish, they simply migrated to the south, west, and east, and left the region. Traces of their presence after the abandonment of Chaco Canyon were found in various parts of the American Southwest. Later in the 15th century, the San Juan Basin, where the canyon is located, was claimed by newcomers to the region, such as the Apache and Navajo. These new inhabitants of the region knew the canyon and were most probably aware of the ruins that the ancestral Puebloans had left, but they didn't occupy them. But why did the Puebloans evacuate? One explanation might be warfare. They had neighbors in the 12th century living on the Colorado Plateau, but there is little evidence of that. Their houses in the canyon don't show many signs of damage that could be attributed to war, with only a few exceptions where signs of burning were found. They were also not built in defensive positions or with defensive structures like walls. So this explanation is not satisfactory. Another, perhaps more important factor is that an extreme drought began a few years before their evacuation. The conditions for agriculture were already not ideal, but they could have worsened significantly, and deforestation would have forced them to go further to find wood. This could have made the canyon too inhospitable and forced them to leave. Maybe it was a combination of fighting and scarcity of resources, or other reasons that we can only imagine. Possibly political infighting or a religious belief necessitated that they look for another land. In any case, the site stopped being inhabited almost 900 years ago and has stayed completely frozen in time. It is only over the past 2 centuries that the history of the ancient Puebloans has been studied methodically, and the site has been rediscovered by the descendants of the builders and by archaeologists. It had been forgotten or become legendary because the Puebloans never built again on such a scale. Looking at how the complexes were built, they impress by their size, hundreds of rooms, and these rooms were substantial in size, not small, with a tendency to place the ceilings higher and higher as decades passed and construction went on. But it is not only the size. A lot of planning was involved. Vast sections or entire wings were finished in a single stage. Each great house had a central plaza, a semicircle, and individual houses that formed the complex. They were all stuck together and became higher and higher with the distance from the plaza. The first line facing the plaza consisted of single-story rooms, and then houses went up like the steps of stairs. Great houses also comprised circular spaces that were partially or entirely underground. These are called kivas. And these rooms, some large, others smaller, were used by Puebloans for various things. They had a religious or spiritual function to perform rites and gatherings, and also probably a political one. It could be the place where the communities gathered to debate or discuss topics of interest. There could also have been places where some people with a particular function in this society lived. Kivas are found at all ancient Puebloan sites, and not only Puebloans. This kind of circular meeting place existed in various cultures of the American Southwest. One thing that has called the attention of archaeologists since they began studying Chaco Canyon is how gigantic the site looks in comparison with the estimated population of ancient Puebloans who lived in this area, and their access to resources, especially food, together with the roads that connect it. This is why it has been hypothesized that Chaco Canyon was not just a place of residence, but rather a unique site in Puebloan culture with a particular significance. The alignment with the sun, the moon, and constellations, and the aesthetic are also elements that indicate a lot of meaning was involved in this site. But why? What was the function of Chaco Canyon? It could have been a place where Puebloans gathered from afar, a kind of capital in a culture that did not work as a state in a sense. There was no central administration and no unique leader. It was decentralized. However, a sense of belonging to the same cultural group could have motivated the creation of a place like this one. Another possibility, which does not exclude the first one, is that Chaco Canyon had a trade significance. The web of roads would have made it the marketplace of ancient Puebloans. It would have had a limited fixed population, and a larger transient population would travel to it. These explanations are utilitarian, and they can make sense. But they don't really tell us why such symbolic care and planning were invested into this site. The kind of alignments that exist at Chaco Canyon were possibly only thanks to generations of astronomical observation. And there is more than simple alignments. The site includes a butte, which is an isolated hill with vertical sides and a flat top that is typical of desert areas in the Southwest. On this butte, a petroglyph called Sun Dagger was discovered. It is made of two spirals placed in such a way that a spear of sunlight, filtered by slabs, illuminates it and indicates equinoxes and other recurring astronomical events. The material used is basic, but the arrangement of this light clock is very elaborate, very ingenious, and reveals an impressive knowledge of astronomy. This is not something unique in pre-Columbian America. Other civilizations had advanced astronomical knowledge based on centuries or at least generations of observation. However, it shows how far the Puebloans had advanced in that field when we take the sun dagger into account, along with the alignments within and between great houses, their semicircular shape, and their very deliberate aesthetic. It becomes obvious that there was a deep intention, symbolical, spiritual, or cosmological, that organized the whole site. But to what ends? This is the core of the mystery. The Puebloans had no writing system, so there is no explicit document to work on, only hypotheses that can be made. Was it a kind of offering to gods? A way, perhaps, of transposing an order that seemingly existed in the heavens to the earth? It is hard to tell, but an idea I find intriguing is that in their view, the skies looked ordered, with the same celestial bodies following cycles. The sun and the moon returned each day and followed patterns that were predictable over the months and the years. In contrast, the earth was chaotic and unpredictable. It could be too dry or too hot. Death happened on it. Based on this, they could have elaborated a cosmology that made Earth the realm of disorder, as opposed to the harmony and eternal order of the heavens. Chaco Canyon could have been an attempt to transfer to our world the orderly nature of the heavens, to create a contact point where the perfection of the cosmos was reflected on Earth, a kind of center of the world, or at least of their world. Our third story begins on the other side of the world, on the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. In the north of Sumatra, there is a large lake with an island in the middle. The lake measures up to 62 miles in length, about 100 kilometers, and almost 20 miles in width, a little over 32 kilometers. Nowadays, it is a beautiful place with blue waters and green hills all around the lake. But this lake is special. It occupies the ancient caldera, the chimney, of a giant volcano, Mount Toba. A volcano so large and powerful it is called a supervolcano. We will see what that means. This volcano is thought to have erupted around 70,000 to 75,000 years ago. Volcanic eruptions are rather common, but this one was so powerful that it had consequences for the whole planet for several years, affecting life everywhere, including humankind. What happened? How do we know that it had an impact during prehistory without any testimony of it? And what is a supervolcano? That is what we are going to talk about. First of all, what is a supervolcano? As the name indicates, they are particularly large volcanoes, but also volcanoes that have extremely violent eruptions. As you may know, volcanic eruptions can take different forms. When magma from the planet's mantle can rise freely to the surface, eruptions can be relatively smooth and look like an overflow of lava. However, when the way out is blocked, the pool of hot magma may stay trapped in the Earth's crust. Pressure builds, and at some point, when the breaking point of the crust is reached, an explosive eruption happens. When the pool of magma that has accumulated is very large, the crust breaking can send huge quantities of material above and around the volcano. A supervolcano is defined as one that has an eruption that projects a volume of deposits equal to or greater than 1,000 cubic kilometers. That is 240 cubic miles. There is an index to measure this, the Volcanic Explosivity Index, and its highest possible value is 8. A supervolcano is defined as one that produces an eruption reaching 8 on this scale. These super eruptions are fairly rare. The most recent known volcanic explosion, reaching an index of 8, took place 26,500 years ago in New Zealand at the Topo volcano. The Topo is now dormant, and its caldera has also turned into a lake in the center of New Zealand's North Island. The Toba eruption would have happened 50,000 years earlier and could have reached even greater proportions. To give you an idea, the largest volcanic eruption in recent history happened in 1815. The eruption of Mount Tambora, also in Indonesia. This eruption caused an entire year of cold in the northern hemisphere. This year has stayed in the memory as the year without a summer, and it had visible impacts on agriculture, the color of the sky, because there was an ash in suspension in the atmosphere. It initiated research that determined that a single volcanic eruption could have consequences for the whole planet. The Toba eruption is estimated to have been 12 times greater than Mount Tambora. It would have deposited a layer of ashes 15 centimeters, that is 6 inches, thick, over the whole of South Asia, with ashes reaching everything from the Middle East to China. These numbers and the size of the eruption could have been estimated by examining deposits left by the eruption in various remote parts of the world. Their composition and dating among geological layers indicate where they came from and when they fell. This suggests, based on modern analysis, that the Toba eruption could have been several times more powerful than the Taupo eruption itself. Logically, this mega eruption would have had major impact on life, possibly causing several years of volcanic winter, with seasons that were considerably colder than usual. Ashes and dust in suspension in the atmosphere would have filtered sunlight, leading to a longer cooling period, potentially up to 1,000 years. Interestingly, this event aligns with observations made when studying the genetic heritage of humans and various species of mammals. It seems that 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, the population of humans, as well as species like African chimpanzees, cheetahs, and tigers, suddenly shrank, potentially bringing them close to extinction. Only a few thousand individuals may have remained worldwide at the peak of this crisis. This conclusion is suggested by genetic evidence. It seems that today's humans are all descended from a small population of between 1,000 to 10,000 breeding pairs that lived around 70,000 years ago. While this is not a certainty, several clues in our common gene pool support it. The same is true for other species mentioned. This theory is called the genetic bottleneck theory. There is a lot of evidence that the human population shrank on Earth at the time of the eruption. However, there is no certainty here, and the dating is not very precise. The date of eruption is estimated to be 70,000 to 75,000 years ago, with a margin of error of several thousand years. We're probably not speaking of a giant explosion that killed most humans on Earth, but rather a sudden change in climate that cut their food supply. Deforestation, the collapse of all food chains, and a decrease in available prey would have led to a reduction in the number of humans over several generations. Another element supporting this hypothesis is that between 70,000 and 60,000 years ago, a major migration from Africa started and populated or repopulated other continents. This was not the only wave, and it doesn't mean that humanity was wiped out elsewhere, but it could be another clue that the supervolcano, which has now turned into a peaceful lake, brought us to the brink of extinction 70,000 years ago. We've come to the end of our little journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. But for now, you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.